As I mentioned before the break, the conversation we are going to have actually pick up, hopefully and probably pick up some of the conversation we had before the break. And also, as I mentioned also before the break, when we were thinking about this forum, we really wanted to include voices from our younger generation, younger in terms of our age. We are like what Rick was saying, we were those born in the 60s, and a major reason really is this movement really is very much has been driven by the younger generation, and I think it is very important to include their voices here from their perspective. So one of the things that Rick in his discussion or discussing feedback was about what this movement is really about, economic or autonomy or whatever. So when I put together this roundtable, I actually proposed 4 questions. This is up to the panelists. How many questions they want to respond to, if they only want to focus on one or all of them, or maybe other questions they want to address. It is really up to them. But the 4 main areas of questions that I suggested for this roundtable is what is, from their perspective, what is at the heart of this Hong Kong's movement. The other is, we hear so many noises, like different people say what this movement is about, the different kinds of public discourse. So from their perspective, what do they see is missing in the international and also the local, in terms of Hong Kong, discourse about this movement. And then the third one is, we talk about Hong Kong's 2019 protest, from today's Hong Kong to the world's tomorrow. So then the third area of questions that I posed was, what do they see, or explore really, the implication of this movement for the international discourse and praxis. So it's not only about, it's about more, we're in the academic space, so in terms of the theoretical and also the practical, really the movement, praxis of decolonization, human rights, democracy, and other areas that of their own interest. And to me, what is most my own area of research is around colonization, decolonization. That was actually back when 20 years ago, my doctoral dissertation. It's about the Hong Kong, the whole struggle between nationalism and colonization and colonialism and post-colonialism. And Hong Kong, being very unique, is a space that supposedly goes through decolonization with no independence. What does it even mean? And then human rights and so on and so forth. And then also, we as Hong Kong diaspora, what we can do, we can offer at this time for the movement, in the longer run. So without further ado, so I have 4. Are you guys okay with the alphabetical order, or you? Yes. So so what we're going to do is each one of them will have about 20 minutes. And then they will share their views. As I said, maybe to all the questions or just one is really their choice, or they add more. That is welcome as well. And then I'll open up. So because it's 2 hours, so after each one of them, then we still have about 45 minutes open discussion from the floor among them. So this is really a roundtable conversation. So welcome, kind of a more lively, interactive conversation. So the first one, alphabetically, would be, I have Justin Cheng here, and he actually flew from Vancouver. Yes, welcome to the first snow of Toronto this year. And he is the representative from the Hong Kong Pro-Democratic Postgraduate Students Association. Do I get the name right?
Not really.
Okay, so it's the Hong Kong Democratic Alliance of Overseas Postgraduate Students. Yes. And he's now an MA student from history in UBC and also a student associate of the Hong Kong Student Studies Initiative at UBC. And so after that, I have Jane. And she says, I am a grassroots participant. So welcome. And if you want, you are welcome to also say a little bit more about yourself. And she has been very active in mobilizing, online and the local movement support for what is happening in Hong Kong. And then after that will be Edward Wong, and he is now a PhD student in my program, School of Social Work at York University. And what is happening?
Someone found out about that.
I don't expect introducing you, and there is
someone doesn't like me.
This is just a kind of a dramatic effect. So Edward also started with a group of Hong Kong. All of them are Hong Kong diasporic.
Some are locally in Hong Kong, but we're pretty spread out. A lot of us
pretty
are
spread international, the activists and also scholars, young scholars, called Lausan. And it's actually, they have an online journal, and they contribute to their writing. And it's from international left perspective, which is actually quite interesting. I really enjoy a lot of the writing there. And then I have Vincent Wong. It turns out we have a lot of Wongs. It's really just a coincidence. Vincent is so William Graham Research Associate, International Human Rights Program, Faculty of Law at U of T. And he also is an active organizer of a group, is the U of T Anti-Extradition Bill.
Oh, no, I'm not a organizer.
You're not, okay.
Those are the
a member.
students. Yeah.
Okay, the awareness group. So, okay, so Justin, it's your time.
Yeah, sure. Thank you first of all for having me here. I'm so glad to be here in Toronto. So again, I'm a second year history master student at UBC. So my focus is on Hong Kong history, but not in the recent past. And so I would like to begin with the introducing my group first. So the Democratic Alliance of Overseas Postgrad Students we just founded in September. So by around 10-ish grad students, basically based in North America, and mostly they are in social sciences and humanities majors. But I'm the only one in Canada. Yes, and the only one in history field. But nowadays, over the few months, we already have over 100 of members across the world. Although the core members only based in North America. And our goals of the group is to connect the overseas grad students from Hong Kong, because we see a need that we have to create a network among us, and also we hope to promote Hong Kong studies at the same time. And also the intellectual exchange between Hong Kong scholars and in the scholars from around the world. And also, of course, we support the democratic development and freedom in Hong Kong. So that, of course, is one of our goals. Okay, so I will answer the question one by one. The first one is about, from my perspective, the heart of Hong Kong movement. So what's that? Actually, if you follow the news pretty closely, then you would know there are a lot of explanations or interpretation of how what this movement is about. For example, we can talk about is about the continuation of the the fighting for democracy since 1980s, when Hong Kong was on the agenda. Or like we can talk about like is the legacy from the umbrella movement that is a peaceful movement that didn't succeed at the time. Then so it turned to be a bit more violent tactic now in the present time. And also we can also trace it back to some time earlier that like how the government have their apparatus and their laws to maintain or to control, suppress the movement. For example, we have the emergency ordinance, which was drafted in the 1920s in the colonial time. And also, some scholars may say that like it's about the identity, how the protesters or how this movement help in contributing to the forging of the Hong Kong people identity. So, but these are all the perspectives that we can find online or on or some other medias. And from my view, it's more about the story of the Hong Kong people, like actually every one of them. So, for example, like I'm not really tending to use some kind of huge narrative to explain it, but rather look into each of the persons, if the protesters experience in the movement. For example, like how did they experience the tear gases? When they are facing the police forces, how would they deal with them? Right? How did they escape from the scene? How would they fight against them? And also some other their own conflict within, for example, within their families, among their friends. Actually, that create a lot of tension, and actually those experiences is different from one another. So I would say that it's pretty difficult to get a huge or full picture of what these movements look like, and and also of course this kind of experience is dependent on your position. Like for example, if you are in the front line or in the back doing some peaceful protest, or if you are, or what you're doing, and also your luck. For example, if you're lucky enough that you did not smell any tear gases in the scene, or that you're unlucky that you got shot by the police, right? So that's actually you couldn't expect that, or you couldn't avoid it actually. But this kind of experience actually shaped how you feel about the movement, and I think that it's important for us to know it's not only about the big narrative of Hong Kong, or how will it be, or how it's gonna be. It's also about everyone on ground, and of course for us in overseas, that how we feel about the happenings in Hong Kong now. For example, for people here in Toronto, or for me in Vancouver, they might have different views, and they might have different experience when they're doing some solidarity events on ground, and when they're facing some kind of confrontation or counter protest by the pro government people. So that's and of course then another view that another observation I would like to make is the how this movement have been shaking the current system. Of course, politically, it's been a lot of changes. It's been a lot of challenges to the government, and also, of course, the law and the orders. It's been a lot of challenge as well when people will disagreeing with the law, like the emergency law, and also some of them may become suspicious of the judicial system, like how the court will trial the protesters. And also, in an economic sense, I think it's pretty interesting to see that people when they are shopping, or when they are eating, they now are more conscious of to pick a store which support the movement instead of those apolitical or ignorance of the protesters. So actually that is that kind of like beyond our understanding of how Hong Kong should be. Like it should be like a capitalist economy, and people make their decisions mainly based on the money. Like we go to the restaurant which has a better quality of food, or which has a cheaper price. But nowadays we take the political side into consideration as well. And of course, the creativity we have seen in over these months about, for example, the Lennon Wars, and also some other pretty very beautiful and efficient propagandas on the social media. It's because Hong Kong has been criticized as like lacking a lot of creativity and cultural elements. But from this movement, we can see that actually there are a lot of talents in Hong Kong that they could produce a lot of impressive designs, and I've got the slogan and also some other songs when they will have some message want to bring out. So actually, this is fascinating to see that happen. And the second question is the missing discourse. Well, I would say that there are a lot of discussions online about the tactics, like how should the protesters deal with the police strategies, like how should they, for example, how should they cover up the tear gases, how should they fighting against the police forces, and also when they were arrested, how should they deal with that, and how do they asking for the legal help, this kind of tactics. And however, I think that very few of them have been thinking about how, like, what the transformation or what the future Hong Kong should be like. For example, we have been criticizing of police brutality, but actually, what kind of police forces we would like to have in the future when we have a chance to really to remake it, right? To rebuild it. Like what kind of police forces we want. And for example, and of course, and this stage when between the confrontation between the protesters and the police forces, there are a lot of hatred created among the society. So how should we deal with that? So actually, I think rather like in addition to the current situation that we have been focusing on, then we also have to think about like how should we deal with that kind of emotional and this kind of emotional hatred. And of course another thing is that like we are lacking a pretty good strategies in conveying our messages to the mainland Chinese people, especially for those in Hong Kong, because we have been thinking that those Chinese people, they will probably bring rosters by those biased state social media, or like they're receiving biased media from China, so they didn't support Hong Kong. Well, but even for those who live in Hong Kong, or as students or as employees, but actually we should think of some ways to connect with them, especially actually they were also suffering from the state suppression. In this sense, actually we are on the same boat, right? So actually I do think that we need to come up with a better strategy to deal with that. And the third question is about the implication from the movement. So so of course we are fighting for democracy. So actually we are in the forefront of the liberal world, and also we are protesting against the state suppression. So I mean, the suppression from stage actually happened everywhere. You could find it in Chile, in other places. There are a lot of examples today, and so that, I think also as a Hong Kong as an example, and also we can have some kind of connection between them, and we can have a common language in dealing with that. And of course, like not to mention the police brutality. And but I think the more interesting observation is about the social in terms of the strategies of the social movement, that like this movement has shown like very innovative method. For example, like we have a leaderless movement and decentralized a lot, and so the government is hard to find someone to negotiate with, and also of course it's hard for the government to suppress it. This kind of stuff, and also the online platform like Telegram and the LYHKG forum. So this kind of online tools that we've been using, I think actually it gives a pretty good examples for the others to see how they could implement them incorporate them into some other kind of protests. And so the last one is like what the Hong Kong diaspora do in the long run. It's like, well, this question is almost like a standard questions in every event about Hong Kong. Yeah, but well, sure, as we can see that many people, like in the late June, in July, there's a lot of like international advertisement about the G20. Of course, we can do that, and also there's some kind of lobbying activities in the States. And of course, like people are organizing campaigns to writing letters to the MPs, senators. So actually, that helps. I would say that really helps. Yeah, and of course, and on a day-to-day personal basis, then actually, well, we can just explain what is happening in Hong Kong to the local people here, because although there have been a lot of media from, for example, from here, from the States, is covering the happenings in Hong Kong, but it's better for us, like the Hong Kong people in overseas, to personally explain what's happening, because that will, I think, it's more convincing from the first-handed experience, especially if you were in Hong Kong like recently. Actually, that will help a lot to get rid of maybe the bias from the media. And of course, there have been a lot of solidarity events or rallies all over the cities. So actually, these are the thing that like many people have been working on, and I think that is pretty much saturated, I would say. Yeah. So I would like to bring up another point that maybe more people have been missing, is that like be more sympathetic to the protester, especially for those who are more violent, because we're living in Canada, and we might not know how does it feel to the protester, to frontline protester, when they were facing the police brutality, when they are facing the fear of being arrested, and you might facing some charges and get to the court. So I think it's really helpful for us to imagine ourselves, put ourselves into their feet, to see that like what it will look like actually for them in Hong Kong. Of course, like I guess some of us, or most of here, we're supporting the movement in Hong Kong, but other than the verbal support, or other than like going to the protest, to the rallies here, I think we are more sympathetic to the protester. Is is another step going beyond that, and that also contributed to ourselves by being a Hong Kong people, even we live in overseas. Yeah. Thank you.
I would like to say thank you to Rick first, because he lined me up with Renita and Wendy, so I could attend and join this event today. I'm Jane, and I am only one of the all the organizers in Toronto's rallies over the last 4 months or so. Of course, not all of them, but most of it, because there are some other groups trying to organize support Hong Kong's rallies with all the other Hong Kongers in Toronto. So talking about what kind of organizations or group that I belong to, it is just a Facebook page called Torontoians Stand with Hong Kong. It is not even an institution, not an organization. It's just a group of people with very loose structure, with no leader, with no formal organization to organize all these events and rallies. I understand that most of the people here are very academic or very structural, but, but within our group, I could not see a structural structure. So don't ask me how we organized it. We just have countless discussion in midnight and then get everything done before the dawn. Okay, so this is something I could tell, and this is the truth. If not, then I could show you the text message in our group. That's all. For example, this morning, we're trying to organize a morning for Mr. Chow, who passed away in Hong Kong time at 8 this morning. So the first second I wake up, I got a message from my groupmate, let's do something for him. And then by 10 or 11 o'clock, we have an event post on our page. This is how we organize the event. Talking about how we make this decision, well, we have voting. This is some so-called the most democratic way everybody is looking for in Hong Kong, and it exists in Telegram group. It is not easy to get all the consents to organize all the events, but at some point we make it happen with a censorship with a large number of supporting votes to one direction and to one event. And of course, talking about how to compromise with all different views, we have fights, we have arguments, and we have different point of view. That's the reason why we have endless discussion, and we have endless unread messages over 8 hours at night. So this is something what I call loose structure, and we have no organization, and we have no leader, or I would say very minimal order. Okay, so let me try to get into the questions. And I'm trying to provide you some of my personal experience, not like the others in next to me.
I think you're insulting us right now.
No, I'm not. I'm telling the truth. I actually graduated in Hong Kong. I studied in Southeast Asian Studies in City University of Hong Kong, and this degree is disappeared and integrated with some other international studies within the department because of the restructure within the department. So you could Google it, but it might not show you any information anymore. So the first question is from my perspective, given my discipline and area and personalities, what do I see at the heart of the Hong Kong movement over the last few months? I actually lost count because we are trying, all of us here, if we would like to follow the incidents in Hong Kong, every 12 to 24 hours there is something huge. Live broadcast, YouTube and Facebook channel, or maybe TG channel, Telegram channel. So it's very hard for us to follow all the information at the same time to organize and react to it. So what I see from this last few months is the Hong Kong style of evolution. So I make up all kind of terms, so I understand you might not understand what I'm talking about, but this is my experience because at first, I still remember the beginning of the movement. We are trying to adopt the first similar method as umbrella movement. We are trying to have rallies, sit-in, to try to let the government know what we are not happy with. But as you may all know that because of the police brutality, they force us to become more violent. And it's because there is something that you need to know. The Hong Kong government did not even listen to us on the first rally on the 9th of June. They implement the act the very next day. Put that act onto the local discussion schedule the very next day. They try to push it and pass it, and that's where we come from. So we are trying to use all kind of methods to let the world know as well. I'm trying to give you some figures. So in the last 4 months, we spent millions of dollars on media. The major media in newspapers, YouTube channels, to broadcast, to advertise what is actually happening in Hong Kong. Even Toronto, we were sponsored to have ad trucks, a mobilized truck, to play videos, what is actually going on. And we would like to draw attention, awareness of the locals. We're trying to marketize it. You might think that it's not useful at all, but then we receive a lot of feedback saying that it is a good way to voice our concerns. Or I could actually explain the Hong Kong style of evolution and sound like do whatever we can at the moment, and we see the problem and we react it. And last night, I was in the other panel discussion, What Now, organized by CHKL. The student she born is Ho Wing Tong. She's born in 1997. She explained to all the people in the panel saying that we're born in 1997. We see what's the problem and we respond to it. Compared with those who did not respond to it, which she is referring to the previous generations. Talking about from 1989, the June 4th, the people from that point of view, they did not respond to it. They tried to turn a blind eye to what had happened in China at that time, and pretended over the last 30 years, after the economic growth in China, everything will become better. Even the human rights, even democracy development in China. And at this point, and everybody knows, that's not true. And what I see is the heart of this evolution is the Hong Kong identification. We all admit that we are Hong Kongers. Don't ever say that we are Chinese. Ethically, we are. Biologically, we are. but our identification is Hong Kongers. This is something that I could tell everybody here as the heart of the Hong Kong movement. We are different from China. From political system, from economic development, from a human being, from a cultural basis, we are different. And one more thing is, we are pointing to the heart, or what we should refer to as the broken system in CCP. Because in Cantonese, it is 個問題喺個制度. The problem is in the system. It's not people. The problem is within the system. The system is broken. It's not a complete democracy. Okay, I know. You may say that the US one, the Canadian one, the US one, the UK one, or the European one is not complete too. But compared with the one we have in Hong Kong now, the one country, two system, we don't believe it.
There's never been a real democracy by any sense. One system, one country, two systems. No, by any sense, there's not a democracy.
We're going to open it up for questions afterwards.
Yeah,
if
we
that's
will
all right.
open up the discussion. So
Thank you for your opinion. Yes, and this is my experience and my point of view. Thanks. And I would like to move on to the second question. What is missing in the public discourse? Well, from what I see in Toronto activities, it's actually my reflection of all the rallies. So, lack of interaction with locals is one of the things I would like to emphasize. We have organized around 5 or 6 rallies, one screening. Most of these events are targeted to the Hong Kong community. No matter how hard we try to reach out the local community, it's like unreachable. Maybe because of our post is not using the Canadian way to express. Maybe this is simply irrelevant to their daily life. Or maybe something is just too far from them. They have no contact with any Hong Kongers except those who have families or they marry to a Hong Kongers. That's something exceptional. And the other discourse is, I'm not too sure if the other people agree here with me because I'm new here. I just moved to Toronto for a year and a half. I see a great difference between the old Hong Kongers and the new Hong Kongers in Toronto. It's literally a generation gap. So I'm saying for those who are 40 something above, they don't agree with me. Most of them, they feel like, yeah, I'm so stable here. What the heck you're doing here? You're destroying my life here. I have to say I'm quite disappointed because they claim that they are Hong Kongers too. They have Hong Kong ID card, but how come we have so different point of view? But that's okay. I understand this is a generation. So this is something I realized from other rallies experiences. And the third question is the invitation to see the Hong Kong movement has on international discourses of democracy, decolonization, human rights, or the specific area of concern in my discipline or activism. Well, I have to say, in the past, Hong Kong people are not very active in politics world since we We are very wealthy, and we do not care about this kind of boring thing. It's not entertaining. Back home in Hong Kong, we have all kind of entertainments, but politics definitely is not one of our choices. I would say we connect different groups: the Ukraine, Tibetans, Taiwanese, Vietnamese, and at some point Iranians. So I got a chance to reach out to local Iranians here. They're as progressive as me. They actually think that we are doing something very correct, and they support us. At some point, they attend some of our events, but there are only a handful of them willing to stand up for us too. So this is something what we called the citizen diplomacy. So after all these rallies, we are trying to exchange information, contact information, our experiences in the venue. We're trying to connect each other and try to reach out what is actually going on in their community too. We're not saying that we did not get enough information from a newspaper or from what they say, but direct interaction is something that I never experienced before. This is something we have to go beyond reaching out the local communities, especially the Hong Kong communities. We have to reach out the other communities. Say for example, there are 3 groups of us. We're sharing something similar, fighting for freedom. Then how all these communities could support each other and form a bigger group to have more influences within the Canada government. This is something we should try, and this is something we have to do. Because in the future, we will become one of the power to influence the government policy. And this is something we have not established as a Hong Kongers. Like, look at Tibetans group. They actually have a committee sitting alongside with the government, asking the government to do something for their community. The formation of this kind of political awareness group is much needed than going to elections, than going to lobbying within the government, because this is something also a chance for us to reach the government, to have a power to influence the government policy. Which I say this would be one of the channel to voice out for Hong Kong people. And for our last question, what support do you see the Hong Kong diaspora can offer for this movement in long run? To be honest, I would like to use Excel Nation for Hong Kong people. Over the last 30 years, a lot of different generations of Hong Kong people migrated to different parts of the world. And Toronto is one of the destinations. And I'm talking about there are close to 200,000 Hong Kongers here in Toronto. We could definitely make a difference if we stand together, stay together, and form a political group. And only if we could stand together. This is not something just an imagination. By 2047, imagine that the CCP take back Hong Kong and take back the one country, two system. There won't be Hong Kong left. And we have to prepare for that. It's not a curse. It's something that might happen. And this is one of the possibilities. Citizen diplomacy is one of the strategy. The other is we have to maximize our political influence power within the government. That's why we have to lobby different MPs as well, and we have to vote. And we have to make all those who could not vote to get their passport to register as a voter. In the last election, considerably there are 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong, but only 2,000 of them register as a voter. And many of them actually, I hope this assumption is not right, but at some point this is the truth. Many of them, they actually don't have passports. So how can we influence the Canada government policy is something we have to put our hand and work our ass off. This is something, if we would like to keep our influences in the Canada government, we have to do something right now, instead of just discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really heart-wrenching day, I think, for all Hong Kongers, for anyone who has a belief in justice when we saw the death of Zhou Jilong. So I think that was how the group was formed. It was very organic. It was just about taking care of each other, and from there we recognized the real need to, we found our friends here, but to there's an anarchist saying in Hong Kong right now from an article about fighting with our neighbors while looking for friends. Well, we had to keep looking for friends, and in order to do that, we had to get our voices out there to connect with people. Not just in the Hong Kong diaspora, but also in the many other communities. So I'll talk more specifically about the work of Lausan a little later on, but that's just the gist of how we formed. I grew up in Hong Kong, spent 17 years there. In fact, I think this black T-shirt, I got this from 2001, I think, during the protests against Article 23 there, and it's been with me a long time. And the reason I mention this is, again, I think I credit a lot of my politicization, the development of my political perspectives to the movement in Hong Kong, to figures like Si Tou-Wah, who was a teachers union organizer in Hong Kong. And a lot of us in Lausan see our work as the legacy of centuries of resistance in Hong Kong, but also in China, the fight for social justice and the fight for working people to have a decent life. So that's the broader history and movement we see ourselves a part of. So I guess when I was preparing this talk, there's the usual talking points about Hong Kong, and I think I wanted to maybe move away from that and look at I think some inspirations I took from what's happening on the ground in terms of how people are organizing, how people are taking care of one another. I mentioned in my introductions that I'm a social work scholar. So within social work, I have a strong interest in abolitionism. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, but I'll explain a bit more in a bit. And secondly, I've also mentioned that I'm an anti-authoritarian leftist, and so I'm also a labor organizer, so I have a real interest in seeing the openings and potential for building a labor movement, an independent labor movement in Hong Kong. So firstly, abolition is politics. So for those unfamiliar, abolitionism has long roots in black liberation movements, especially in the United States, born out of a struggle against slavery, but later on, especially with the Black Panther Party, connecting this analysis of slavery to the criminal justice system, recognizing that the criminal justice system in the U.S. has very much continued slavery in another form. Now, and with that analysis also comes recognition of the role of policing as a political tool, as a tool for maintaining the current political order. Going back to Hong Kong, this has become very evident that as every day passes, we're seeing more and more of this abolitionist consciousness come out. A lot of this stems from the daily confrontations I've already mentioned briefly, the traumas even, for us, we're in the diaspora, we're looking from afar, we're witnessing it, we're picking it up vicariously, but on the ground, people are physically confronting police violence every day, and this type of issue is leading to actually the emergence of the so-called sixth demand. I mean, a lot of people have heard of the 5 demands in Hong Kong, but the 6th demand calls for the abolition or the disbanding of the Hong Kong police force. Now, while violent policing is in no way new, I mean, in Hong Kong, just ask any Vietnamese, South Asian, Black Hong Konger, or you can ask sex workers or street vendors in Hong Kong who've experienced the daily violence of policing much longer. But I think more Hong Kongers are beginning to realize, given how indiscriminate the violence has become. And we see that reflected in the popularity rating of the Hong Kong police force dropping to almost single digits. People are angry and people are disillusioned. And it's almost been a daily occurrence where, I mean, sometimes from afar, people might presume that this anger is strictly from maybe a core group of frontliners, but in fact, it's very widespread. You see in neighborhoods across Hong Kong, when the riot police come, the residents come down and start heckling and calling the police corrupt. I mean, this has been a very commonplace feature of the movement right now in almost every neighborhood. So that's policing, and that's a more obvious aspect of abolitionism. In social work, we're starting to see applications of abolitionist theory to social services. So a recognition that oftentimes social services intertwine with policing as a means of social control. And applying the abolitionist critique allows us to reveal what these issues are, but also to explore new possibilities, especially around mutual aid practices that move around from this kind of formal institutional social services. When I say, going back, I mentioned how there's a recognition that social services are intertwined with policing. Hong Kongers are also realizing this right now, and there's been a number of prominent cases of child protective services in Hong Kong targeting young protesters. The very famous case from a couple months back was, I think there was a couple 15, 16-year-old kids who were just watching a public screening of a documentary. The riot police came in, took everyone away, and the children were taken away from the parents on the claim that by participating in this screening that was negligence or like that the parents weren't fulfilling their duty of guardianship. This is alarming, but again, not surprising if we look at how child protective services has often been used, certainly here in Canada, but all across the world. So, I mean, that's a gloomy part, but the beauty right now also is in the resistance, in that Hong Kongers are finding different ways to address social needs, but that's in opposition to the state. So when I say mutual aid, I'm referring to voluntary reciprocal exchange of resources and services for mutual benefit. So people helping each other because of mutual benefit versus kind of the top-down approach you might see with social services. This practice is evident in almost every protest where you see supply stations being set up, where various supplies from rolls of toilet paper, saline solution, asthma inhalers, eye mask, and of course the famous umbrella. These are often donated by Hong Kongers, maybe people that aren't in the front lines, as a way to support people directly engaging. We also see local residents distributing food to protesters, single-use subway tickets, and also non-black t-shirts at subway stations. The significance, of course, is for people getting away from the protests. The black shirt has become the uniform of the protest, and we've had, unfortunately, many cases of police, just as long as you have a black shirt, doesn't matter if you're even at a protest, people getting arrested or beaten up, right? So it's a way to escape. So that's been one ubiquitous example. Another example that's become more prominent recently, and which has gotten some news coverage, is the issue of the general public's distrust of the Hong Kong police has spreaded to the healthcare system too. This is based on allegations that the hospitals have been sharing identification information to the police, and that the police were using that information to target protesters. There's also been a number of cases of mass arrests or arrests that have happened at the hospital. So in sum, a lot of protesters, and forget protesters, Hong Kongers in general, have a real fear about getting healthcare at hospitals because they feel they'll be targeted. They feel that the police will be there waiting. Instead, we've seen a whole network of underground clinics that sprung up and emerged as a, out of that desperation, out of that need to survive, that a lot of volunteer healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, traditional Chinese medicine providers have been borrowing cars and using it as a kind of a mobile clinic to treat injuries ranging from inflammation, respiratory issues. The long list, the worst injuries are, of course, from tear gas, from rubber bullets, from beatings. We also see, I have background in mental health field, so it was really exciting for me to hear this, but we're also seeing in the area of mental health where people are, there's been many prominent examples of social workers in the front line with protests or helping de-escalate, especially when there's issues of a crisis of suicide. There's also Telegram network, chat rooms for connecting people who need the emotional support with counselors and social workers. So I think there's something really exciting happening on the ground here, and I'm not going to quite follow the questions strictly, but later on we have a question about what can the world learn. I think this this type of initiative is really inspiring for how the world might move forward in terms of social justice. So in fact, so broadening, I know, in terms of what this heart of the movement is, I think we've heard a lot of unfair criticism from admittedly kind of marginal elements of the left that kind of paint this movement as right-wing. We're basically hearing it from the CCP also in terms of their mouthpiece. In terms of how this is a right-wing movement, how it's about bringing in the West and all these very reductionist ideas about what it's about. Now, I'm not going to lie, I can't pretend it's explicitly left-wing movement. It certainly isn't. But at the same time, I think we need to see the liberatory potential in what's called prefigurative politics. So what that means, that term, is that when we see organizing practices, so some of the mutual aid examples I just talked about, can reflect the political futures that the people engaging in them are working towards. And I'll argue that the tactics we see on the ground are very much a reflection of anti-authoritarian leftist desires. So I've talked about mutual aid. The other aspect, which the other speakers have actually touched on so far, is the idea of decentralization and direct democracy. So partly owing to the targeting, the imprisonment of a lot of the key organizers during the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, and out of that necessity, protesters have exported or changed the decision-making structure towards more kind of equal basis. So Lin Deng, which is the website LIHK. Oh God. All right, I'm gonna try to speed through, but I'll skip all this. The point is that organizers are trying to operate very directly democratic to avoid kind of the formation of a core leadership, right? And same idea behind Mo Dai Toi, where stageless, exactly, right? So and this has even expressed itself, kind of this intentional distrust of established political organizations. So it's not to say that politicians aren't involved. We, in fact, see many pan-democrat politicians in the front line. But the point is that they aren't put on the pedestal. They aren't taking on that leadership capacity. I'll briefly mention as a labor organizer what's exciting is that much of the protests have happened in the context of the workplace, right? We've had multiple simultaneous rallies at almost 20 hospitals. A lot of the actions and the protests have revolved around when a colleague gets assaulted by the police or arrested by the police. So the Disneyland Performers Union actually threatened to go on strike after one of their members were, after having lunch or dinner, were kicked down and arrested. And of course, there was the general strike in August, the biggest since the early 20th century. We've seen protests by social workers, teachers, bus drivers. Unfortunately, it's also a big reminder that we need a strong labor movement in Hong Kong, given the major issues of reprisal and white terror we've seen there. The flight attendant union has been one of the leading unions in Hong Kong, and in response right now, Rebecca Tsai, its president, was fired after engaging in protest action. But again, I have a strong hope. Last couple of days, we've seen an uptick in materials and flyers being distributed, providing information on how to join unions. There's been, a strike fund being formed to try to sustain a longer general strike than one day. So I think these are all very exciting initiatives. I guess I'll try to conclude. Unfortunately, there's a lot I'm gonna miss there. I'm not gonna make it. But I think all I have to ask in terms of, others here is, that aren't maybe directly connected with Hong Kong, is to try to see Hong Kong with a bit more nuance, right? To understand, to recognize how complex the protest movement is. We certainly have major political groupings, but ultimately, as a political movement, it's still in formation. I mean, most people are very new to politics coming in, and the deliberate actions around decentralized leadership has meant that no one political perspective has necessarily taken hold. So with that in mind, I mean, we really need to push against both some elements of the left that might frame the movement in Hong Kong as driven by the CIA, as this Western-led movement. It's blatantly false. I mean, we can have disagreements of tactics. I certainly don't believe we should be appealing to Western states, but it's much more complicated when we look at, as Rick Sin talked about earlier, the meaning behind these demands, right? Is it out of desperation? Is it a flippant way to piss off the government? There's many different reasons for it, right? And it's dangerous when we presume again that it's this imagination that people are calling for the West to come in. It's much more complicated. On the other hand, we also see far right and right wing people here in the West try to appropriate the movement to frame this as the bulwark against China, against communism. But I think that's, again, dangerous, and that part of that is that it ends up erasing the complicity of the West in the authoritarianism that we are fighting in Hong Kong. This lack of... So, and not just Hong Kong, in China in general, like we've some prominent cases. So Blackwater, the famous mercenary military contractor company, has a company linked to it that's helping China with training camps in East Turkestan and Sangang, so with the Uyghur people there. We've had a lot of surveillance technologies and weapons supplied to the Hong Kong police. And much of the current Hong Kong government and the power structures we have in Hong Kong are the vestige of British colonialism. Carrie Lam, our current chief executive, was a British civil servant. Donald Zhang, a former chief executive, was actually knighted by the British Crown. And today, a lot of high-ranking police officers coordinating the violence are British officers, white British officers who have stayed in the territories after '97. And of course, the tycoons that we hear a lot about, the real estate tycoons, the very rich people in Hong Kong, also made their money under the British rule. They're still there, and they still hold huge sway over the city. I mean, I don't have time to get into functional constituencies and all that, but our electoral system is literally built around maintaining these individuals in power, right? So I think we need to be careful in presuming the West as our friend. The West, in fact, the West and China, not just in Hong Kong, but all across the world, are deeply intertwined in the oppression of regular people. And I'll just end with one sentence. As a diaspora, we're in a unique position to connect with other communities. So right now we got Chile, we got Ecuador, we got Rojava. So and Kashmir. We have a lot of movements that are seeing these contradictions and wanting to fight. And I think our role is to build an international movement where we connect with regular people, forget these states, these countries that will more than happy to turn their backs when opportune. Let's focus on real people and let's fight together. Let's find our friends in these movements. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank our organizers and my amazing co-panelists here today. I didn't know actually this morning whether or not I'd be able to come. My emotional state is in such kind of like a disarray, especially after the news of Zhang Zilong passing away, and so it took a lot to kind of just drag my ass up here. But I know we're talking about self-care and collective care, finding friends, and that's been really important. I wanted to say a little bit first about my positionality. I was born in Hong Kong, but I grew up here in Toronto, and I have tons of links in Hong Kong, friends, family. I go back very frequently. One thing I wanted to also stress about positionality was I worked for about 4.5 years at the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. We mainly provide legal assistance to low-income, primarily Chinese, but also Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Laotian communities. So we kind of work together with folks, and not surprisingly, the majority of the folks, our clientele, are Mandarin-speaking mainland immigrants, and so we really work from an anti-racist kind of perspective. And we work with them, and so there are brothers and sisters, and then so I come from that kind of work perspective as well, right? And so the first question that was posed was, from your perspective, and you're given discipline and positionality, what do you see as the heart of the Hong Kong movement over the last few months? Now, I thought long and hard about this question, partially because I just don't want to essentialize nor speak for the movement, right? I only speak for myself, but also because my answer keeps seeming to change all the time. If I were to boil it down to political science, I would say conceptually, the collective right of Hong Kongers to self-determination is probably at the core of this. Roughly, of course, after the 1984 British Joint Declaration, it's roughly reflected in the quasi-constitutional order, as one country, two systems, which, over many years has started to really fray. I'm also a human rights lawyer, so from a human rights angle, I would say, human rights has kind of deteriorated in Hong Kong, not just in terms of civil and political rights, although that is true, but also in economic and social rights as well. And, for a lot of the human rights scholars, you might, know that human rights as a concept is supposed to be, interdependent and interrelated and indivisible, right? But I was also behind that, and Rick talked about this, and there's a lot of kind of reading between the lines. Behind this human rights frame is just fear, just a really fundamental kind of element. Fear of what? Okay. It's both fear and political disillusionment. And Ed talked a little bit about functional constituencies, but we talk a long time about that. But basically, Hong Kong's political system, as kind of handed over from the British, I think the gentleman there said it's true that even under British colonialism, Hong Kong has never really had a full and meaningful democratically accountable government, right? And functional constituencies are a way in which needlessly complex, but each kind of business group and sometimes even corporations have voting power that is not offered to the broader public, and then so these things can be easily politically captured by a combination between essentially pro-Beijing interests, political interests, and business tycoons in Hong Kong. So that's roughly it. And so, we hear a lot, for instance, about the ridiculous rising property prices and rents, right? Hong Kong is the highest, if not among the highest, in terms of rent per square foot, right? And the enormous amount of money that Hong Kong government gets from land premiums, that cannot be redistributed in general services, right? So that's funneled because of this collusion of political and business interests into crazy expensive white elephant infrastructure projects instead of subsidizing public housing or offered in terms of social services. So you have this enormous not only wealth inequity, but actual enormous rising difference in living standards, right? And that's why the political and the economic factors, they collude. They're linked, they're interlinked. And I want to talk a little bit about fear. To no one's surprise, the human rights situation in China is, over a period of time, especially after Tiananmen, not great, right? But there are levels to this, right? And the straw that really broke the camel's back, I think, occurred in terms of the development of fear for Hong Kong people of the Chinese government on August 29th, 2016. So what happened there? Some guy got a job. Which guy am I talking about? Chen Guo, right? He got a new job, no longer party secretary of Tibet, moved over to party secretary of Xinjiang, right? And he set about essentially creating the most, comprehensive state apparatus of high-tech mass surveillance and control perhaps ever imposed on a population in human history, right? And as news started slowly leaking out of this kind of mass internment camp apparatus, whether it's satellite imagery, human rights reporting, investigative reporting, interviews with survivors, which has essentially painted this horrific story of a mass extrajudicial incarceration project and a cultural genocide project. This really set the fear of God into Hong Kongers. So there's this, you probably see this kind of graffiti or this, today's Xinjiang, tomorrow Hong Kong, right? I mean, the thought of fighting a future which is essentially a police state, mass surveillance, constant fighting with police brutality kind of future is not very appealing to the people of Hong Kong, and it's not probably not appealing to a lot of people, right? So I think that fear is really in the back of it, and the fact that the Xi administration, since at least 2015 and before that, has essentially dismantled the ability of Chinese civil society, human rights defenders, journalists to pose any sort of kind of counterbalance to this executive access, has led to the development of these massive human rights atrocities. They're never addressed. And that is in part from a human rights perspective, because I have to, fueling what is going on, the fear that is going on in Hong Kong. And I don't think that fear is misplaced, to be perfectly honest. And so that is kind of what I would say is driving, one of the reasons it's driving the Hong Kong movement. What do you see missing in the public discourse in understanding this movement? I'm going to speak internationally, again, from my positionality, because I can only speak for myself. Personally, nobody else, personally, I think the resistance itself is often not framed properly, okay? It's obviously a big tent resistance, and we've talked about it a little bit, Rick's talked about it. Lots of different kind of politics and positionalities and opinions within this enormous kind of full-out resistance, right? And then so it's improper to generalize what the political future that they envision is, right? Lots of different opinions on that. It's much easier to understand, though, what they don't want to be, right? And this is important because if you can conceptualize what people are fighting against, you can understand kind of where the battle lines are drawn, okay? And most of them, I would say, would agree that they are fighting against the current kind of Chinese regime. And what are the elements of the 2019 kind of Xi regime? I'll throw out some elements out there, okay? Conjuring like a mythic past that is supposedly being destroyed, right? The pre-colonial China kind of history of humiliation. We need a strong man father to restore our lost greatness of China. And Xi is the man, right? Abrogate term limits for president. We have somebody in charge. 2, powerful and continuing nationalism, right? Flag, slogan, song everywhere. Kind of expansionism, imperialism, right? Through the United Front, of the work that we see here in Canada, through Belt and Road, kind of economic expansion. Identifying enemies and scapegoats as a unifying cause. So you can think about separatists, terrorists, religious extremists, foreign hands. These are ways of drawing people closer in a Chinese ultranationalism that sees everybody else as the enemy, right? Obsession with national security. There are labor movements that are suppressed, activists that are constantly jailed in China. Mass media is controlled to an extent that has always been controlled, but is really, really properly controlled now. An obsession with law and order and police power. This number 7, I'm going to say, is really important. The corporate power colludes with state authorities, right? So this is why this is different from 1960s, 1950s, certainly China, right? This is no longer, it says Chinese Communist Party, but there is very, very little Chinese communist, very little communist about it, right? Use of business interest to fulfill a nationalistic agenda. So these two kind of forces of state-directed capitalism they feed upon themselves. And the final one I'm just going to flag is attacking the truth relentlessly with propaganda, right? A particular kind of anti-intellectualism, right? And so if we add those all together, boy, if only we had a political descriptor for all of these elements, right, in a political ideology. I would offer a word for it. It's called fascism, right? It's fascism. And that, in my view, is what the resistance is. And feel free to disagree. I only speak for myself. The resistance is this anti-fascist resistance, right? Hence the common use of the term China-Nazi, which is really kind of problematic and reductionist. But it refers to the fascist ideologies that the people in Hong Kong are facing constantly, right? And so this is where I think the liberal kind of resistance meets a limit, right? Because electoral democracy is not sufficient to fight fascism. Mm-hmm. Like, look at what's happened in the US. Look at what's happened with the Modi BJP India and Hindutva, and how it's affecting Kashmir as well as other places in India, right? So look, it's clear that if the lines are drawn properly, the solidarity kind of shifts, right? And it allows us to see, the proper terminology allows us to nuance our understanding on an ideological level of what we are resisting, right? And the contours of our strategy and efforts. It limits cozying up to right-wing folks in different places that may espouse many of the same dangerous lines that the current Chinese government does, right? And that this is really important. So when you see folks that are looking about a mythic past, make America great again, ethno-nationalism, curtailment of rights and freedoms, violation against press freedom, fake news, like maybe you don't want to hang out with these guys. So I'm going to even talk about Canada, right? Because Canada's kind of thought of as liberal bastion. Canada has a massive problem with police killings, with impunity, with toothless oversight. Even here in Ontario, right? We have the OIPRD. That is supposed to be the police civilian oversight. Hong Kong, the Carrie Lam government brought Gary McNeely, who was heading the OIPRD, to lend legitimacy to their kind of toothless, police oversight system where they have with CAPO and the IPCC, which is actually very, very similar to the OIPRD, right? So they're using this. You think Canada's so great? Well, let me tell you, we're drawing the same thing from Canada. Anti-mask ban, right? So about a month or so, the Hong Kong government used the Emergency Regulations Ordinance for the first time since 1967, and they passed a mask ban. And let me tell you, like, Canada passed a mask ban in 2013, and its penalties are worse than in Hong Kong. It's 10 years in jail, right? And which is not to say that there was a massive kind of civil liberties, human rights resistance to this mask ban here. But what I'm saying is that you have to nuance your arguments, and elevating the Canadian state that they could do no wrong because they have this kind of democracy is perhaps, it has its limits, right? I'm not saying it has no value, but you run into ideological limits there. Okay, how am I doing on time? Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay, I will say one thing because, like the kind of diaspora thing has been handled already. What implications do you see the Hong Kong movement have for international discourse on democracy, decolonialization, human rights? Okay. As it stands now, mainstream Western media and Chinese-run media, in their view, the Hong Kong movement is kind of being framed in a way that strengthens Xi's idea of the world as these kind of new Cold War. Right? This is not a news. He spoke about this directly with Obama in 2013, right? There's this massive kind of Chinese influence sphere of the world, there's the kind of US sphere, and then everybody has the coalition of the willing or whatever. This is highly problematic for Hong Kong because it is at the confluence of both, and therefore will be used and abused kind of as a bargaining chip in this binary geopolitical struggle. This is kind of dangerous. And so, one of the things that we've been trying to do at Lausan is to add nuance to this coverage, to add a decolonial lens that situates the protests, the 2019 protests, in a history of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle. First against British colonialism, and then against Chinese imperialism, right? The situation of that as a struggle, constant struggle for a right to self-determination, okay? And one thing that I do see in the Hong Kong uprising that has updated, spread internationally is, and I think some of my co-panelists might have addressed it, updating the book of practice tactics, right? So where you see this incredible kind of decentralized leadership, some people think it's all chaos, but actually if you look deep inside it, it's a practice of radical democracy, right? It's very leader-full, but nobody is elevated. You have all of these at every single level of executive decision-making, for group decision-making, you have some sort of vote, right? Black bloc tactics and group defenses, right? So we're entering an era of mass surveillance in almost every place in the world, particularly China. What do? Laser pointers, right? We're gonna mess up this like facial surveillance stuff so that they can't attract us, or we'll spray paint or break the CCTVs. Kind of adopting new ideas like airdropping, using Apple AirDrop to actually spread messages to tourists from the mainland so that they can kind of circumvent mass media, which is much easier to be state controlled. And sort of all of these kind of different, and all the tactics of putting out the tear gas. I mean, you have to, Chile's doing it, Catalonia's doing it, so that those things are extremely important. And when add to Ed's point and Jane's point about citizen diplomacy, when we talked to folks a couple of days ago from Kashmir. Like when we were talking about protest tactics, they immediately got it. And so that is extremely important and probably an area, if Hong Kong movement is to really embrace kind of a diversity of tactics, and if there's something that we can do here in overseas diaspora, really easy to have those conversations, right? To meet with the rest of the world. To meet, I think, with other people that are resisting fascism, and to share and to build strategy, to build understanding, and to build power together. So that's my view on it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for this really, really thought-provoking